Hi guys. So I'm going to be presenting chapter 7, Sexuality, Boundaries, and Ethics. So with this chapter, it addresses the wider lens of sexual ethics by exploring sexual attraction to clients, sexual harassment, sexual intimacy with current and former clients, and warning signs for therapists. So with this chapter, it has 4 topics. So the first one is sexual attraction to clients. In this section, it talks about how sexual misconduct is the most common allegation and ethical complaint in the therapy world. While we know having sexual attraction to our client is wrong, we have to become aware when we begin to notice these feelings of attraction and be ready to address it. However, many therapists do everything possible to avoid the opportunity to address the issue. So, therapists being sexually attracted to their client can cause a therapist to feel shame, guilt, and even anxiety. So, the book explains how sexual attraction is common in a therapeutic practice because of the process of therapy. Because the process of therapy naturally creates intimacy due to the therapist and client meeting together alone to discuss the details about the client that can be intimate. Typically, these details are being shared by the client that are intimate conversations that usually get shared only with close individuals to the client, if the client even has any close individuals. So, on our end, as therapists, we initiate the joining process with our client to create the good therapy for our client and establish good rapport with our client, in which the joining process is what helps create the intimate nature of therapy that can be confused with feelings of attraction, sexual attraction. So, therapists are faced with the biggest challenge, which is the same intimate environment where we thrive in is the same environment that may lead to a fine line being crossed, thus possibly leading to the ethical boundary of sexual attraction toward a client. So, what are we supposed to do as a therapist if we begin to experience a sexual attraction to a client? Well, the first step is that we as therapists are, sorry, the first step is accepting that we as therapists are still sexual human beings. Just because we're therapists doesn't mean we'll never experience a sexual attraction to a client. One thing to keep in mind is on page 123 is experiencing a sexual attraction to a client is not itself unethical, nor is even having like a sexual fantasy. It's making the choice to act on the attraction or fantasy, or to even deny the attraction to a point at which it embeds therapy that is unethical. The book goes on to provide advice on what to do when experiencing a sexual attraction to a client. So, advice number 1 is acknowledge your feelings and be self aware. Kind of ties back with chapter 5 of being self aware as a therapist. So, anyways, we have to recognize that our sexual attraction does not make us a bad or unethical therapist. It actually just makes us human. We have to understand if we were to meet the client in another setting, it's likely that you still would have that same sexual response. So basically saying that it's normal. But as therapists, we need to know our personal needs and vulnerabilities, and we are more aware, more likely to address challenges like in a healthier way. So the common mistake is minimizing or avoiding addressing the sexual attraction, which creates a missed opportunity to consider critical clinical issues, thus leading to acting on the attraction. So by ignoring or avoiding the feeling, it actually may create a discomfort or anxiety for the therapist that the client might even notice. So it kind of creates like some kind of confusion or discomfort for the client, which may hinder the therapy. So advice number 2 we must know our values. Everyone has sexual values. These values may come from a religious or spiritual background. Examples of values can be sex must be consensual, or sexual attraction is normal, even if it is to a client. For therapists to practice in coalition with their values, the values and beliefs need to be known. Therapists can reflect on how sexual thoughts, emotions, or actions either support or oppose the therapist's values and beliefs. So, advice number 3, you do not give your problems to the client. So, this means not to tell your client about the sexual attraction because this could run the risk of harming the client. Some therapists believe that withholding the information from the client is what leads them to act unnaturally with the client. So these therapists believe that telling the client about their feelings is actually the right thing to do, but it is not. Instead, therapists must act responsible, refrain from disclosing their sexual attraction to their clients. Instead, therapists should seek out advice somewhere else on how to manage their feelings to avoid unintentionally disclosing their feelings in session. There are potential dangers and risks in revealing feelings of sexual attraction that can increase the risk of engaging in activities in therapy that could be labeled as sexual harassment. So on page 124, the book notes that revealing sexual attraction may on page 124, the book notes revealing sexual attraction may put the therapist at risk in engaging in activities that could be defined as sexual harassment. So, advice number 4, confide in your supervisor, peers, and professional consultants and use personal therapy. So, we can't find a solution about something if we don't talk about it, right? By talking with supervisors or colleagues, it can normalize the situation and resolve the feelings. By talking about it, therapists can calm any kind of worries and help refocus their energy on the process of therapy. Personal therapy can be used as self-care and part of risk management. So, advice number 5, do not refer out. Referring a client out because of feelings of sexual attraction may lead to the consequences of discontinuity of care, including uncertainty, loss of time, and possible feelings of rejection in the client. So it is highly recommended that a therapist does not refer a client out. However, if referring a client out is absolutely needed, the therapist must be extremely careful not to imply rejection or abandonment and should provide time to discuss what the referral means to the client. Therapists need to explain that they are unable to meet the needs of the client. If therapists choose not to address their attractions and begin acting out their attraction, then they will engage in one form of sexual harassment. So, moving on to the next topic is sexual harassment. So, sexual harassment can have unique definitions, but the most common themes in this definition is described as unwanted sexual attention. So, there are many forms of unwanted sexual attention, they can look like name calling, to jokes, to physical touch, to sexual assault and rape. So the motive of sexual harassment is to obtain sex or to abuse or increase power. Overall, sexual harassment is a boundary violation that can occur from a therapist to a client or even vice versa. So to maintain boundaries, therapists must be aware of their values and reactions to clients. If the therapist begins to feel uncomfortable about a client's sexual statements or actions, the therapist should discuss these issues with a supervisor or a professional consultation. The therapist can use a client's inappropriate boundaries therapeutically, helping the client establish healthy boundaries inside and outside of therapy. So it is critical to be aware that the therapist can create a sexual harassing environment And there may be some clients who may not be able to verbalize that the therapist's comments or actions are harassing. Therapists must pay attention to the client's values and body language. The book gives an example such as a therapist noticing how a client responds to jokes, touch, or the clothing of the therapist. So risk for sexual harassment is high because there is a clear power differential, leaving the client with the inability to freely consent. So in this section, it also mentions how it is realistic and common where a client makes sexual advances towards the therapist. So as the therapist, we must know how to ethically respond to these situations because we have a duty to ethically respond to sexual advances in a way that does not place blame or burden the client. So client sexual advances can be either extremely obvious or not so extremely obvious to the point that the therapist may or may not believe that the client is actually making sexual advances. So obvious advances can look like client verbally stating that they would like to date, kiss, or sleep with the therapist, or a client can even make physical advances such as sitting on the therapist's lap or attempting to kiss the therapist. So not so obvious advances can be a client's continuous interest in a therapist's personal life, reoccurring interaction in the form of phone calls and office visits, flattery in the form of compliments, and body language and physical cues that may include sitting in a revealing posture or touching one's body and wearing provocative clothing. So the book does give advice on what to do in these situations. So advice number 1 is set limits while giving the clients a safe space for self-expression. So clients who act seductively are actually testing limits. So the right thing to do as a therapist is to create a clear boundary that allows clients to explore concerns within the safety of the boundary. Creating a safe space for self-expressions may involve choosing not to comment on provocative clothing or behaviors such as stroking their leg. So by a therapist having a discussion with their client about their ethical limitation, it is effective because it shows the client that the therapist will take it upon themselves to maintain safe boundaries while lowering the risk of client feeling embarrassed or even personally attacked. So advice number 2, don't be rejecting. I honestly thought at first advice number 2 sounded funny, but at first after reading it, it actually makes sense. So a therapist who rejects in a cold manner may communicate to the client that his or her sexuality is unacceptable, rather that it is simply being directed at the wrong person. So the book provides a few examples I found to be helpful to show how to handle a situation as these. So one example is, I appreciate your interest in me. It's flattering. But if you have found our conversations helpful to you, I think I could continue to be helpful by staying away from any other role. Or another example is, that's not what therapy is. Can you see how the response is? It's not rejecting or it doesn't even personally attack the client. So advice number 3, express non-sexual caring. What this means is that we should not react to sexual advances from a client that takes away from our nurturing role as a therapist. So clients who behave in a sexual manner are actually seeking nurturance. By creating a boundary and defining one's role as a non-sexual caregiver, the therapist is communicating to the client that acting out sexually to attain warmth and caring is not necessary. This is highly important for a client who has history of sexual abuse. So, advice number 4. Do not be drawn into answering personal questions or giving the client other double messages. Therapists should be mindful of their answers and responding back to clients' sexual advances because there is a risk in sending a double message. For example, a therapist shouldn't respond with, I cannot have sex with you because it is against the rule. That is actually sending another message to the client that can be interpreted as, if it weren't for the rule, I would have sex with you. So saying this kind of statement would defeat the purpose of creating a clear and unethical boundary. So advice number 5, confront the issue straightforward. So as awkward or difficult it may be to confront an issue like this, we absolutely have to because ignoring it will only worsen the situation. So we have to confront the issue the moment it becomes a problem. We can approach the issue by having a conversation that is non-judgmental to the client without placing a label on them or by making an accusation on the client's motive. So on page 133, the book provides a perfect example of what we could respond with. So it goes, I may be wrong, but I've noticed something in our interactions together that I want to address. Sometimes it feels like you consider a relationship to be more than professional, and I want to assure you that this is the line that I will not cross with you or any other client because I respect our therapeutic relationship too much. See how that sounds non-judgmental and doesn't harshly accuse a client? I'm actually going to save that statement. So the next topic is sexual intimacy with current and former clients. It is absolutely prohibited for mental health professionals to not engage in sexual relationships with present or former clients. That even includes clients' romantic partners or family members. The reason being is the relationship between the therapist and client can be jeopardized and ruin the therapy process and future therapeutic relationship while damaging the image of the therapist. So between the client and therapist, the therapist carries power over the client due to the therapist having knowledge to the most vulnerable parts of the client emotional life. The client does not have the same knowledge of the therapist. So if a relationship were to surface, it would be an abuse of power. So this section provides consequences that both therapist and client will endure if a relationship were to surface. So as for the client who experiences sexual exploitation, it can cause the same consequences that are experienced from victims of incest. The book explains that the boundaries are being crossed the same way boundaries are crossed in the case of incest. The reason why is because the therapeutic relationship mirrors the differential between power differential, between a parent and child relationship. If a client is sexually exploited by the therapist, feelings of confusion, loss, emotional turmoil, shame, fear, self-blame, loss of trust, isolation, rage, intense guilt, poor self-esteem, and even suicidal or self-destructive behavior may be experienced by the client. So the book goes on to mention consequences for therapists who engage in sexual relations with their client. So in many states, having sex with either a client or even a former client is a crime and can be punishable by imprisonment. Sexual misconduct is one of the most frequent reasons for malpractice lawsuits. Therapists can lose their jobs, their livelihood, and career. Other damages include liability for supervisors, consultants, and the agency or organizations that employ the offending therapist. Also, the therapist will lose respect from their colleagues. So, sexual misconduct also obstructs the mental health field because clients no longer trust therapists. So, moving forward, the last section is warning signs for the therapist. The book provides some warning signs a therapist may be moving from an attraction to an unethical boundary breach. So, the first warning sign would be the lack of self-care. Therapists do not participate in self-care, which leaves them unable to effectively manage stressors in their life. They can seek therapy to manage feelings or to address personal or professional stressors. The next sign is client meets therapist needs. So therapist begins to share their personal problems with the client. So therapy starts to meet the therapist's needs instead of the client's needs. So therapists must be aware of their feelings, thoughts, and needs. So the next sign is making exceptions for some clients. For example, therapists do not see clients on the weekends, but they'll make an exception for one client. So another sign is seeing a client as special. So a client may be seen as special for a number of reasons. Examples include like beauty, youth, fame, or community status, intelligence, or a therapeutic challenge. So the next sign is personal and professional relationships become blurred. So examples include like a therapist attending a client's birthday party or some kind of other social event or having coffee together. So the next sign is problems with boundary setting and initiation. So limit setting for some therapists can be difficult. They may feel that limit setting may worsen a client's distress, and clients may express distress or discomfort or even frustrations when encountering limits set by therapists, which may be difficult for therapists who feel obligated to meet clients' demands or who are intimidated by not meeting clients' demands. The next sign is life crisis, illness, transitions. These stressors all increase the chance of sexual boundary crossing. Another sign is role reversals. For example, therapists who are lonely may find relief in confiding to a client, thus corrupting the therapist and client relationship. And the last sign is denial. So therapists who deny early problems can be more vulnerable to boundary violations later on in therapeutic relationships. They may think the boundary problem is not serious or maybe rationalize away the problematic boundary. So overall, that's what the chapters covered. I really found this chapter to be interesting, and I really think it correlated with the chapter I did earlier, chapter 5. Like I said, it really emphasized how we really need to be self-aware with our own emotions, what our thoughts are, because reading this chapter, it really just shows how avoiding or ignoring the issue does not go away. It doesn't have a solution to the issue. So like I said, with something like this, not only are you causing harm for yourself, you're causing harm for your client. So it speaks to me more how much more responsibility we have in taking the initiative to find a solution to this problem rather than just trying to sweep it under the rug, hoping it'll go away. But that's all I have, guys. Thank you for watching.